Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today, we are reading issue number 150, which is the final issue of the Hard Times story arc. So what's been going on so far is John is in prison. He has been put here for killing someone, we're not exactly sure who. And issue by issue, John has slowly taken over this prison until at the end of the last issue, there was a prison riot that just started, and that's where we left off. So first things first, with issue 150, we got the cover. We see once again in the background the jail bars motif, and in this one, the three horizontal panels are of three guys standing on the balcony of the cell block, the electric chair, and a bald man who looks kind of like a police officer or something going into the prison. And over these three panels, we see John Constantine standing with his trench coat closed, his arms are crossed against his chest, and he has an unlit cigarette hanging out of his mouth. And as we turn to the first page, we see probably the guy from the cover, who's a white guy who's bald and has a goatee and looks to be some sort of agent. He has a trench coat on like John's, but a suit underneath it, and he's taking off his weapons and giving them to another officer as he's about to walk into the prison, and we see the prison is smoking from the inside. It looks like the National Guard has been called to help stop this riot because there's a bunch of soldiers and a bunch of tanks and army helicopters as well. So as the bald agent goes towards the entrance door, we see some prisoners open the gates. And over this, the agent's narration says, "So this guy walks into a psychiatrist's office, wearing nothing but a saran-wrap diaper, and says, 'Doctor, tell me the truth. Do you think I'm crazy?' So the doctor, he takes one look at him and says, 'Buddy, anybody can see you're fucking nuts. This prison has been unofficially in the hands of the inmates for 3 days now. I'm going in to negotiate its official return, wearing nothing but a smile and a saran-wrap diaper.'" And we turn the page as he enters the gate, and we see that prisoners immediately grab him and hold guns to his head. And even in this front gate area, there's a bunch of carnage happening. We see people hanging from walls like they've been lynched or something. In the background, there's two men beating another man to death with a baton. And then there's a bunch of people just kind of standing around watching. And we also see on this page that the name of this issue is Hard Time Conclusion. And I think I forgot to mention, but it is written by Brian Azzarello with art by Richard Corbin. As we turn to the next page, we see these men that have captured this agent are walking him through the prison, and pretty much everywhere he goes, it just looks worse and worse. And as he looks around, we see, a man being chased by a knife, and his narration says, "3 days. No power, no fresh water. Could be 27 hostages, but that's a half-full viewpoint. And this is definitely a half-empty situation." Then we see the agent walk by a man in a cell drinking from a toilet, and the prisoner doesn't look sad or disgusted. He's actually got a really big grin on his face. And the agent says, "Oh, Calcutta." And then his narration says, "God damn, so much shit, it buried the fan." Then they continue walking into different areas of the prison, and the next room they walk into, we see a guard that has been disemboweled and ripped in half. And the agent sees this, and he's kind of shocked, but he keeps walking, and his narration says, 26 hostages. This is absolute no fucking around stone cold hell. It's exactly what prison should be. Leave it to the inmates to get it right." And as he thinks this, we see a group of men in a pile, and they're kind of on top of someone we can't really see, but as the agent is walked closer to them, we see at first it's the men surrounding a black woman that's very busty, but that is just what the men huddled around her are seeing. Because if you remember from last issue, this is actually Trailer, who's being sexually assaulted and beaten up by all these men around him. And Trailer is actually conscious enough to look up and see the agent pass by him, and he says, "Help me." Like he's saying, "help me," but he's too beaten up to really talk. We even see the men that are surrounding him have a wrench, and it looks like they're about to hit him in the face again. But of course, the agent can't really stop to do anything. He's got a gun at his back, and he's being escorted by these prisoners. But also, I think he doesn't really care about what's going on in this prison, because he says, "Sorry, sweet pea, I'm federal. What you got looks like a domestic problem. Then we walk into another cell block area, and this one looks even crazier. This is probably where the riot started because there's a lot more police officers in here, but it is just their bodies. They have mostly been decapitated, and their bodies are hanging from ropes that have tied them in like a Jesus Christ pose to the balconies, and one of them is even hanging from the ceiling. And as the agent walks through this, his narration continues saying, 23 hostages. Fuck. Normally in these situations, we get a list of crap-ass demands. The retard's report card, I call it, because it's all F's. Food, fucking, and fairness. But in this instance, we got bubkiss. So the cock of this walk, he figures he don't need anything. Too goddamn bad, because I got something he wants. And we see the prisoners escort the agent to a door that says high voltage, and then the agent is allowed to walk in alone. So as he opens and goes through the door, he sees John Constantine sitting in the electric chair. And John even has like the electric chair headgear on. So it's kind of like a crown, and he's sitting on his throne of this prison castle. So the agent takes a good look at John, and then he walks up and says, John Constantine, I presume? And then he pulls out his badge and flashes it to John and says, Frank Turro, Special Agent, FBI. And John just kind of smiles at him and says, really? And just what is it makes you special, Agent? And Frank just pauses and takes a second to think as he stares at John, and then he says, a 10-inch hog. And then John adds, and a pair of brass balls hanging too, I suppose. That why they send you in here? And Frank answers, nah, I'm here because your file, my friend, is on my desk. And then Frank kind of walks away from John towards a burning barrel in the corner, and John asks, my file? I haven't done anything to warrant the scrutiny of the bleeding FBI. And without turning around, Frank says, don't fucking try and con me, governor. Not with all the nasty shit you've been involved in. Then we see Frank pick up the remnants of a nail bat, and he pokes around in the fire bin, and he says, I got news for you, pal. Every Joe Blow pulling his putt on the net's got one. See? A file is full of what we consider indiscretion. And you, John Constantine, have a fat one. Yes, sir. Uncle Sam could have busted your limey ass 1,000,000 times over for fraud, extortion, criminal conspiracy, all that real shadowy stuff. Well, guess the fuck what? An infrared scope makes those shadows bright as a sunny day. And John seems offended by this because he says, I could have your heart. But Frank cuts him off saying, don't have one, so can the theatrics. I'm not some rube asking you to gaze into your crystal ball and let me and me alone know what the lotto numbers are. And as he says this last line, he pulls out a skull from the bin with the stick, and we can see the burnt flesh has a swastika on it. So this is probably the skull of one of the Aryan Brotherhood guys. So as Frank looks at it, he continues saying, speaking of which, Richard Lucky Furman, ring a bell? And as he says this, he drops the skull back into the flames, and as it falls, the skull hits the side of the bin, and it bursts apart into tiny fragments. Then Frank turns around, and he looks at John as John answers his question about Lucky Furman, asking, what about him? And Frank says, you tell me. Smart guy like you? Busted for murder? What, you have a brain fart at the time or something? I mean, your hands are always dirty, but they don't get that kind of stupid dirty. And then John pulls out 2 cigarettes and lights them, and he says, had a few pints. And then he hands Frank a cigarette, and Frank takes it and says, that's your excuse? Bullshit. That's your style. Murder, though? That's a bit too personal. Then Frank takes a big puff of his cigarette, and John says, think so? And then Frank begins to walk around John's electric chair, and he says, no, so. Now tell me. And John asks, why? And Frank answers, because you've got nothing to lose. And then John gives a smile and says, except all this. Then he thinks about it for a second, and as we turn the page, we see he does give in, and he begins to tell the story about his friend, Richard Lucky Furman. So John says, well, Constable, Lucky was a wanker. Bit of a git, but well-versed in the art of the con. We pulled a few way back when, so I had a soft spot for him. I was on holiday, and he got in touch through certain channels I'm not willing nor able to divulge. So in these flashbacks, we're seeing an American town, and there's a bar called Leroy's, And as we cut inside of that, we see John sitting on a stool next to another guy, and that man is saying to John, "I'm serious, John. This is the shit. It's mythical, man. The big score. There's a fortune to be had. We play this right." And we see John taking a long sip of beer, and then he says, "I do think I'm being done. But looks to that, mate." Then we get a panel of Lucky staring at his beer, and it looks like he's thinking very hard into it, like he needs this to happen, and he needs John to go along with it. So he turns to John and he says, "Look, I'm in hot water. Big fucking trouble." And John says, "Lucky, you're always in trouble." And then Lucky gets very serious and he says, "Not like this, dude. I got a fucking bounty on my head." And then John turns to him seriously and says, "How the hell did you manage that?" And Lucky answers, "How do you think, man? Fuck the wrong guy." And John sarcastically replies, "There are no right guys to fuck, you dopey bastard." But Lucky just gets more angry and he says, "Come on, John. When they're rich and ripe for the taking, that's what you do, right? Take them. We both know you pull a grift on some honest mark. They're trapped, right? They can't go to no cops. Sure, they get pissed, but mostly at themselves because you made them look stupid. And that's the beauty. Their own embarrassment keeps them in check." And then Lucky slaps his forehead and says, "'Cept this mark turns out to be super motherfucking rich, and he don't need no law to settle your hash." And John asks, "Let me guess. You want me to shit this geezer up, huh?" But Lucky doesn't really answer. He just turns from John, and then John smiles and says, "And risk having a bounty on me own head?" And then Lucky looks up at him smiling, and John turns away from him, and he looks at himself in the bar smoking and doesn't say anything. And then Lucky stares down at his beer again, and he says, "So you won't do it?" And then John puts his cigarette out and says, "No, I won't." And without looking at John, Lucky says, "Fair enough. Then I'm dead." And John finishes his beer and says, "There are worse things. Cheers." And then Lucky pulls out $1 and he hands it to the bartender and he says, "Hey, Chubby, give me some fucking jukebox quarters." And as the bartender obliges, Lucky asks John, "You like Hank Williams, John?" And John answers, "You mean that yodeling hillbilly bollocks?" And as Lucky walks over to the jukebox, he says, "Fuck yeah, man. Hank, now there's a fella had some demons. I can relate." And John kind of jokingly says, "I can't." And as Lucky's making his selection, he gets an evil grin on his face and he turns to John and the barkeep and he says insultingly to them, "No? Then I'll put some Beatles on in your honor. And Fats Domino for you, beer man." And John doesn't look too insulted by that, but the barkeep has a sour look on his face and he says to John, "Your friend's a real douchebag." And John replies, "He's more of an acquaintance, actually. And yeah, mate, I suppose he is." Then we cut to some time later while John is using the urinal in the restroom, and there's actually a mirror above the urinal, which is kind of weird, but I guess you're going to stare at yourself as you're taking a piss. But behind him, he sees the door open, and he sees Lucky walk in, and he says, "Hey." And possibly before he's finished, he turns around and puts his hands up because Lucky has a gun pointed at him, and John says, "Fuck." But then Lucky gets a smile on his face and points the gun towards the ceiling. And with a smile on his face, Lucky says, "Chill out, man. I'm not going to shoot. Scared you, huh? Sorry." But John looks very angry, and then he turns around because I think his dick is out, so he puts it back in his pants and zips up and says, "So you fucking should be." And then he turns around and says, "Give me the gun." And Lucky asks, "Why?" And I should say that Lucky has terrible trigger discipline, meaning he always has his finger on the trigger, even as he's passing the gun directly to John or pointing it at John. And John isn't like the best with guns either, so he just kind of pulls the gun out of his hand, but luckily it doesn't go off as he says, "Sod why? Give." And then he points the gun at Lucky's face and he says, "How do you like it then? Having a pistol pointed at your fucking face." But Lucky just stares at him, and with big sad eyes, he says, "Do it, John." Like he's begging him for real. And then John lowers the gun and says, "What's this? Are you fucking mad?" But Lucky grabs John's hand and forces it in front of his face again with the gun pointed at him. And with tears in his eyes and a very angry look, he says, "Nope, I know what I'm doing. I called you, didn't I?" And then Lucky drops his hands with the gun still pointed at his face, and he waits for John to shoot him. But John doesn't do it. He just holds still for a second, and then he gives Lucky the gun and says, "Collect your own bounty." And then he pulls out a cigarette, and as he lights it, Lucky takes his advice, and we don't really see it. We just see the aftermath of the sound of the shot fired and John being covered in gore and blood. Then we turn the page and we cut back to present out of that flashback, and John is smoking with a sad look on his face like he should have done something more. I don't think he really thought Lucky was going to do that. And he says to Agent Frank Turro, blew his jaw and the back of his head right off. A bit of his brain snuffed out me cig. And we see in this next panel that Frank has moved away from John's chair, and he's next to what looks like an electrical disconnect, which is one of those electrical boxes that has a big arm on it, and you can push up to turn it on and down to turn it off. And he seems to be kind of hovering there. And he asks John, so why'd you do it? And John says, I just told you I didn't. And Frank asks, No. What you just said, I figured that was how it went down, more or less. Thing is, you let the prosecution railroad you. Why? And then John looks down very sad, and he says, I shouldn't have given him back the gun. And then he looks at Frank pointedly and says, and you said yourself, Turro, I've been involved in some very nasty shit. Maybe this time I felt the piper needed to be paid. And Frank says, come on, you're telling me you felt guilty? But John doesn't say anything. And Frank asks, over it yet? And John answers, does it matter? And Frank answers, nah, not particularly. What does, though, is this prison. And then John kind of smiles evilly and says, you want it back. Think I'm in a generous mood then? And then Frank says, hand it over, and you're out of here. And as John hears those words, it looks like he's actually thinking about taking them. And then he asks, a trade, is it? What's the catch? And then Turro asks, you ever hear of S.W. Manor? And John answers, who hasn't? And then John realizes what Frank was saying, and he asks, he the geezer that had it in for Lucky? And Frank just kind of smiles. And I should also mention that Frank has started messing with the arm of that disconnect box, which is pointed down in the off position, but it seems like he might be thinking about switching it on. And like I said earlier, John is wearing the electric chair headgear as a crown. And I think this is just supposed to be some like tension built into the artwork, because he is eyeing that arm almost evilly. And in the next panel, he actually grabs it, and it looks like he might even flip it up. And John asks him, why should I trust you, Turro? And Agent Turro says, you shouldn't. I work for the government. So what's it gonna be, Constantine? You'd rather be a king in hell or a stooge in heaven? And right there, I think they give it away. I think in the art, they're implying that if John doesn't work for them to get this S.W. Manor guy, then Agent Turro was going to turn the switch on. But luckily for John, John thinks about it for a second, and he stands up and he takes the headgear off, and Frank says, abdicating the throne, huh? Smart. Oh, speaking of which, King John, that little baby has its own separate generator, and while the main power was cut, well, flick of the switch, and zzz would have been lights out on the Empire. And then he puts a hand on John's shoulder and he says, let's go. So as Agent Turro walks John back through the prison, everybody just kind of stares at John, and he gives them a look, and they all put their weapons down, and they clear a path for them. And then one man kind of gets on his hands and knees and comes out of the crowd, and he says to John, please, play with me. And it is actually Mr. Stark, the lifer who used to control everything in the prison. And Agent Turro looks down at Stark and asks, who's this jackballs? And John answers, him? Why, that's a little bugger without any friends. And then we see Mr. Stark crying to himself as John and Agent Turro walk away. Then we turn the page and we cut to what I guess is the warden's office. And John is getting dressed, and Agent Turro is writing something down. And he's saying to John, you ever hear the one about the necrophiliac in love? And as John pulls on his trench coat, he says, yep, everything was rosy till the twat split on him. And then he looks down at the piece of paper that Frank Turro is holding out to him, and he asks, what's this? And Frank answers, directions. Figured you might want to pay your respects. And then they walk over to the exit door, and as Turro pushes the door open, he asks John, ready? And as John walks out, he turns around to Turro and says, say Turro. And Turro says, yeah? And John, with a very evil-looking face, says, next time you're with your lovely sister, give her a few strokes for me. Then John walks out into the bright sunlight, and he shields his eyes with a big smile on his face looking up at the sky, And then in the shadows in the background, we see Turo standing and he says, "Hey, Constantine." And John turns around and Turo says, "See you in the shadows." And that, my friends, is the end of the issue and the end of the first story arc of Brian Azzarello's Hellblazer run. So let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you guys like this? It's definitely different than the rest of Hellblazer has been so far. But I do like how they kind of left it where John is definitely supposed to be working for the government, trying to take down this SW Manor guy. We'll have to find out next time what happens with all that. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com, and we will see you on the next one.